Hello, everyone. This is Dylan Lawrence Moore with the Volitional Science Network with Nima Mahjour of economicsjunkie.com, and we have a very special guest today from the land of humidity, dancing fireflies, overpriced ski resorts, and very awesome beer. We have Styxhexenhammer666 from Vermont on audio. Thank you very much, Styx, for taking the time to talk with us today.
I'm really glad to be here finally. We had 3 different delays, I believe.
Well, I just assume you're so busy making videos 24/7 that you just don't have time for anything else.
No, it was Bernie Sanders' fault. There were gremlins in the system.
Well,
you redistributed your time, man.
So what we wanted to have you on for today, because Nima and I talk economics a lot. It's mostly Nima's fault because he's the economics junkie. I just kind of picked up on his coattails. But at least I have been watching your videos for a while, and you make a lot of economic commentary. But I wasn't really able to find a video specifically on it recently because I feel like you kind of throw it in a video that's about something else. So unfortunately, in preparation for this, I wasn't able to find a recent video and say, okay, let me make sure I understand what your position is specifically. But we wanted to talk about national debt, national deficits, and taxes, actually.
Yeah.
And I've heard you say at least I think I've heard you say these things in other videos, one of which is you're for a constitutional amendment for the federal government to be required to have a balanced budget every year, I'm assuming. I've also heard you mention that you feel that the national debt and the national deficit is quite out of hand, although you don't quite get the same sense of economic doom that a lot of Austrian economists or libertarians get. And the prescription, I think I've heard you say, is essentially slash taxes, slash spending, particularly taxes against small business owners, in order to allow the economy to generate the money that could generate a surplus, which over years could eventually pay off the national debt. Yeah. Did I have that? Am I close?
More or less. I believe the concept of a balanced budget amendment, modified maybe for my wishes, would simply be there should be a cap on the proportion of a person's income, regardless of what endeavors they're in, that should possibly be taxed. We've got a system right now where you've got 10,000 pages of taxes that apply to each person. When they work, they're taxed. When they produce, they're taxed. Their home is taxed. Their car is taxed. The fuel is taxed. There's income tax. Everything is taxed. I think that it's too much. I think that we should simplify the tax code, number one. That would save money, ironically, and a lot of trees. And then simply hold it down as much as possible while balancing the budget. If that requires the destruction of half the federal government's bureaus, so be it. We can make do with less. Those bureaus had a time of creation. They weren't there before they were created, and yet we survived as a nation, and we were already a power 100 years ago. I don't see any compelling reason why we need to spend so much money.
So we actually agree with most of what you just said there, but specifically I want to look at the budget itself and what your opinion is on the country having a debt, and why you feel that a balanced budget is a good thing for the country to have.
Well, the balanced budget doesn't necessarily eliminate the concept of debt. It's just year over year. If you already had debt and you balance the budget to a zero-sum game, you'd still have debt. You just wouldn't have a net deficit. I think I know that there's been a perennial argument for centuries about the concept that having a national debt either can be helpful for economic reasons or it can help bind the country together because no one's going to secede or rock the boat too much if there's debt held. I understand that. That's a totally separate issue. But year over year, the government should not be able to run up more and more debt to unlimited levels. Because what you get is a point at which, because of government incompetence, or because people don't want to change the economic situation for election means, you could end up at a tipping point where we're no longer able to budget at all. We're no longer able to make ends meet. And the only options are press out a couple $1 trillion coins to pay off some or all of the debt, hyperinflate everything, and have a real problem there. Or borrow from other countries, beg, borrow, and steal, or start a world war or some other crazy thing like that. Or you go into austerity mode where the government's no longer able to pay for anything. And then you really do have no choice but to cut. I think all of those situations would be disastrous. It's not so much about debt, it's about continuous deficits that right now seem to have lasted forever. We've been running them up for several decades nonstop.
Got it. Okay, that's the sort of opinion from you I was looking for, or the understanding from you I was looking for.
Yeah.
So, Nima and I wanted to introduce some economic ideas to you and see what you thought of them. And we'd like to actually start off with some points of contention, or they're going to sound very outlandish, to see if we could start a conversation from there. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so the first point I got is balancing the U.S. national budget would actually cause an economic crash. The second one is that federal taxes don't actually pay for federal spending. In fact, they don't pay for anything. And the third one is that public debt is private savings in the most mathematical sense.
Well, on the third point, I do believe most U.S. debt is not indeed held by foreign nations. Correct? It is held domestically. That part I understand. Yeah, that's one reason why I'm not so much of an alarmist about the concept of debt. A lot of people think that 100% of it is held by China, and I know that not to be the case. Like I think the second largest foreign holder of debt. I think the U.S. public and then U.S. businesses and banks, if I believe, are number one and two.
Also, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about the Fed separately. I agree with Ron Paul, maybe more on that.
The Fed is definitely integral to this conversation.
Yeah.
So
you've got to understand, however, I'm not an economics expert. I didn't actually study anything about economics. My own point is that a government should fundamentally operate like a household. If you've got some debt, fine. You've borrowed in order to stimulate yourself in some way. You needed to expand your house in order to increase your productivity. Like I could take out a loan, build a studio with that money, potentially make more, pay it off, and in the long run be better off. My point is that continuously compounding that, asking for limitless growth and acting like there is no hard end potentially to that debt spending, I would say that's where I would differ maybe with some people.
Nima, did you want to jump in?
So let's talk about the household. Maybe you just said the government is like a household. So the problem is that if we observe the fiat money system as is, as it's been built up and implemented over the past thousands of years, the issue of the currency isn't really like a household at all. And if they acted like a household, that would be very problematic. So, for example, if you imagine a fiat money economy that sort of starts, from the beginning, it usually starts with a sovereign. Let's say we have a hand-to-mouth existence economy, and I'm a tribal chief, and I introduce a currency called Nima bucks. Yeah, because I'm narcissistic, I guess.
I will gladly accept those in place of Bitcoins any day.
So I can so I basically tell my entire tribe, okay, every one of you now owes me a tax in Nima bucks every week. So everyone owes me 1 Nima buck per week, for example. And so now my tribal members will say, okay, but we don't have those Nima bucks. How do we pay you the tax? So I now have to start spending those Nima bucks into existence by making them. I make them out of leather bands or whatever, and or some kind of mechanism to make sure they're not counterfeited. But
wouldn't they be exchanged in the primordial sense simply for goods in lieu of taxes? Like the farmers would give you like a bucket of cabbages, or the miners would give you a piece of gold, and then you give them Nima bucks. They begin circulating, and then they can just pay in the currency.
That has also happened, but you've also just had where a government would just say, okay, we're imposing a new tax and we're introducing this currency, and you all need it because you need to pay the tax. And then I'll leave you some in your pockets at the end of the week so that you have some savings, so you're prepared for the future, so you can trade amongst each other, etc. So basically what I've done here is I've deficit spent Nima bucks into existence. There wasn't any Nima bucks before. And I've just said, okay, I'm going to create these Nima bucks. I'm going to tax a certain portion out of those out of existence. The remainder, the deficit, is the private sector's net aggregate savings that the private sector has been allowed to accumulate. So it took a government deficit from the very beginning, or from the primordial sense, as you said, of the inception of a fiat money economy, in order for it to be able to function and for the private sector to actually be able to exist and not to be plundered. Because if I said, okay, you all owe me 1 Nima buck per week, and then they say, okay, now how do we get those? And I don't spend those into existence, then I'd have to start taking their private property in lieu of the Nima bucks. So,
but once you've already introduced that money on a substantial basis, you don't need to keep printing and inflating forever. Eventually, you could potentially deflate it as well.
It's possible, but
I mean, when you print more money, I think at this point we should be printing money just to replace old, outdated bills, which are taken out of circulation and replaced with new ones over time anyway, preferably.
The problem is that we observe, if we look at the, just the US, for example, from 1776 through today, anytime the country ran a budget, a balanced budget or a budget surplus, we had actually a depression afterwards. It's a very sure thing, type of causality. If the government in this country runs a balanced budget, we have a depression. Or the one exception was 2008, where we had the so-called Great Recession. So there seems to be a certain amount of these super safe assets that need to be injected into the economy every year. It doesn't really have to be much necessarily. We can talk about amounts, etc., and the size of the government. But there seems to be a certain a routine amount of deficits that needs to be injected into a fiat money economy in order for people to have enough money to pay taxes and to save up money, because the private sector also wants to net save every year.
Yeah, that may be true. I'll accept that could be the case. Although I mean, we could have a separate debate over that. I'd have to look at like the dates of economic crashes probably to rebut that. Mm-hmm. It would be what proportion of debt should there be to the population per person and so forth? Can it increase faster than the population and still be safe? What are the long-term consequences of debt at that level that's never been seen before in the world? And also, what proportion is foreign held as opposed to held domestically? Also, what about other countries that hold the debt? Some of them themselves have debt. Like I know Japan has a great deal of debt, I believe. And yes, the U.S. holds some of it, which is very, very interesting that we hold Japanese debt. They hold U.S. debt. I think in a lot of people's minds, they would ask why you couldn't simply cancel all of that out. I'm sure that there's some complex reason why Paul Krugman wouldn't agree with that. But
well, it technically, I guess, in aggregate, it does cancel itself out if you look at the final current account surplus or deficit, in a sense. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this so-called debt, sovereign debt, is sloshing around. But the fact is that this type of debt is very, very different from private debt. And we also find that, whenever the federal government runs a balanced budget, the private sector starts going into excessive private debt, interestingly. So we don't achieve our objective of reducing debt.
Yeah. Could that be due to consumer confidence and people taking out, loans that may be higher risk?
Yes, but it's because when the government balances the budget, then it deprives the private sector of a certain degree of safe assets and income. So the private sector then resorts to borrowing from the banks to be able to afford their lifestyle, etc. We find that for example, the 2000 .com bubble bust, the 2008 financial crisis, we always started going into sort of balanced budget territory, and the private sector goes into excessive debt to income, which is unsustainable. At one point, that debt actually has to be paid back and tends to collapse. And when that collapses, then the private sector stops consuming, and then we see a recession, etc.
What then happens, though, when the government's own debt reaches that unstable level.
Well,
so wouldn't you then have potentially a depression that ripples across the world that would be greater than all the other recessions and depressions combined and collapse the whole world's economy into nothing?
So, as Nima was pointing out, there's a difference between the debt that a government has and the debt that a money user like you and I, or even a local government have,
or state,
or a state, because the issuer of a currency can't actually get itself in a place where the debt is unsustainable. It can always pay its debts because it has the ability to issue currency. Now, we can talk about inflation in a sec too.
It's magical.
Well, in a sense, it is that money kind of is magical because it's not a real thing. It's just an idea, right? If all human beings disappeared off the face of the earth today, there would be no money in existence, even though there would still be gold and pieces of paper and maybe some computer entry still bouncing around with the electricity that's still in existence. But for the government, debt isn't something that's really an issue because they can always create more. And in fact, one of the things that we're arguing is that's the only way that they actually make money. This idea that the government taxes our income or taxes self-employment or taxes corporations or taxes businesses or whatever, and then turns around and uses that money to finance the debt actually doesn't make sense, because an entity which has the ability to create money out of nothing at will can't actually require money from somebody else in order to pay it off.
But it can destroy the value of that currency and thus the holdings of all of its constituents, including its political donors. Like George Soros, who has billions of dollars, would not be very happy if the US dollar hyperinflated and the political elite hadn't allowed him enough time to switch over and buy a bunch of yen or euros or something beforehand, because then he would fundamentally be holding less value, at least because the fiat currency would be worth less in purchasing power.
Correct. However, what we're also going to say here, and also, by the way, we totally forgot to mention this. This is an economic theory called modern money theory, or MMT. We totally spaced saying that. So, what? This isn't just me and Nima, getting together and being like, we have these ideas about this. This is an actual theory that's out there.
I'm willing to entertain any monetary theory except for the Marxist one.
Oh, we cool, bro.
We will print limitlessly. Give me your money.
Yeah, so actually, one important point I think I just want to interject is there is a concern about inflation, definitely. And when the deficit gets too large, then it can cause inflation at some point. So we're not saying spend limitlessly. We're just saying spend enough so that there's full employment. And given that, when the economy started, a tax is imposed, people are made unemployed, there's a certain amount that has to be deficit spent into the private sector in order for it to have full employment. But then
wouldn't this beg the question? Wouldn't this beg the question? However, shouldn't experiments be done to see how little can be done and still have that full or near full employment?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah,
and we completely agree.
So we're totally in agreement. Dylan and I, we've talked about it a couple of times where we're saying you should just cut pretty much all income taxes, etc. Have a very low, maybe base level tax that would already be sufficient to give the money value. We're just saying you don't have to necessarily cut the spending as quickly, even though, if you cut taxes a lot, then the private sector is flush with the net private savings. We wouldn't need a government as large as it is today to be able to sustain full employment. So we could achieve the objective of reducing the size and scope of the government by just starting to cut taxes and not worrying so much about the deficit is our point.
The more pragmatic political problem would be getting politicians to cut politicians' staff. So,
oh, yeah, no.
I think, unfortunately, at the moment, it's impossible. It's like trying to inject term limits or campaign finance reform. We have to get people who benefit from the corrupt side of these things to actually consent to removing that corruption.
Right, but
it'd be very difficult.
It's easy to just change a couple of numbers in the tax code. That doesn't require a lot of mobilization, doesn't require big projects.
Yeah, but it requires years of debate by senators who don't know anything.
which is what
they know
we're
how to
having
defend a
conversations like this
corporation.
for.
That's why we're having discussions. Yeah,
we need a techno meritocracy with YouTubers running the government.
Man, I don't know.
Be a better world.
as long as you don't hire the ATL. Yeah.
I want to say this about inflation, though. One thing that Nima mentioned, and I think is worth emphasizing, is that unemployment is actually a government-created phenomenon. That the fact that the government demands a tax, particularly in Nima's primordial example, where it's clear to see, what's going on, the demand of the tax is the thing that creates the unemployment, because by definition, employment means you're working in exchange for whatever the unit of account is. And a unit of account is whatever you have to pay your taxes in.
Or self-employed, potentially. Like you could be a hunter-gatherer. You wouldn't be unemployed. You'd just be living a subsistence lifestyle.
Well,
what we're saying is employment doesn't really make sense at that point.
Well, you're not you're not involuntarily unemployed in that case. We're worried about the involuntarily unemployed, basically.
The fact that the government's forcing you into this position where you have to pay this tax in this unit of account that they created out of nothing.
Yeah.
So in terms of inflation, as Nima mentioned, inflation is a real issue, and particularly hyperinflation is also a real issue. However, when it comes to spending more money into existence, if you spend money into existence and that money also creates more goods and services, you're not really going to notice any inflation, because as the money supply increases, the amount of goods and services that can be purchased increases. The problem, and this is what MMT warns against, is once the country is at full capacity, which means everybody's employed and all the factories are producing as much as they can produce, at that point, if you start introducing more money, there's no way to actually make more goods and services with it. Yeah. So then the increased money supply would start causing inflation.
So it would deal with population density too. Like if you have a highly dense area in which people have to travel inordinate distances just to produce, and efficiency is thus lowered, it'd be a little bit different than a semi-rural area like this, where potentially, like this neighborhood could, if it were agricultural instead of just suburban lawns or whatever, could produce a great deal. As you put more people in there, they each need homes. Even if you make them more efficient, very compact homes or hobbit homes or something, eventually you hit the sort of tipping point at which adding more people reduces efficiency instead of increasing output.
I never thought about it that way. I was just thinking about the people that already exist and whether or not they're employed.
I would argue that the world is very close to comfort capacity already. Well, at some point you end up having to spend more money on frivolity to make people more comfortable, because the actual efficiency, the actual abilities of productivity have already been surpassed. That is, if you look at like Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a population greater than Russia. The government there has to supply certain things to people, just to maintain basic order. And even then, it's still sub-third world. It's extremely impoverished.
I think the topic just got switched. I'm trying to put my finger on it.
Well, density would definitely, at some point, the world has so many resources that can be utilized. If we were to massively raise efficiency so we could utilize the maximum amount of resources without destroying the world entirely, like stripping its surface bare, my point is that there comes a point at which it is impossible to produce more. And I would argue over time with technological advancement, the efficiency, the manpower needed lowers over time, post-industrial revolution.
I agree. However,
we'd have to kill off half the world's population once we get to the point where there are a bunch of robots roaming around.
Well, I won't take that extreme of a stance, but before we get into what like the maximum amount the Earth can handle, we're talking more about if the government has created a problem, and this is kind of a libertarian anarchist hat that we're wearing, which is we've got this issue. We've got an entity with a monopoly of the use of force telling us that we have to pay these weird units that this entity creates out of nothing. It involuntarily puts us in a position where we have to get employed in order to pay this tax. Now, in a system where this is the case, and this has been the case for all countries everywhere, always, essentially, and it's definitely the system that we have right now.
Yeah.
In order for someone to get by, really, and of course we're not talking about, we haven't added the welfare state into this equation yet. In order for someone to get by, they have to have the possibility to get access to the, I mean, they're essentially tax tokens, whatever you call them. And if there's not enough access to these tax tokens that the person can't actually do anything productive, more tax tokens actually need to be spent into existence, or on the flip side, less need to be taxed out of existence in order to fully utilize these resources. And in the example we're talking right now, people being employed is one of those resources.
Yeah. I think it's also important to mention that the U.S. economy is only at about 70% of its full capacity, according to a statistic from the Federal Reserve of St. Louis.
How so?
Because there's factories that are idle, there's machinery that's unused, things like that. And that indicator has started moving up actually after Trump's election, but it's still far below, full capacity.
And I would say that, like with my aversion to certain political systems, any proposed fix can always be more pragmatic or more utopian in nature. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is meant to move towards a sort of utopian goal. Would you say that it's more pragmatic, though, and that the idea is simply to lower unemployment insofar as you can, control debt insofar as you're able, and try to eliminate as much misery as possible? Or is there some sort of utopian end goal to it?
So what we were hoping to talk about first was just
equilibrium.
But before we talk about what, like, me and Nima would like to see out of this, we're trying to talk about, like, the ground rules of how the system works, because ironically enough, the people promoting modern money theory in the sphere of, online discourse at this point, are actually the Democratic Socialists. Bernie Sanders' economic advisor, Stephanie Kelton, is one of the big MMT promoters out there. And almost all of the rest of them are leftists. And when Nima was actually approached me, or I found him talking about it in the recesses of the internet, and I saw what he was writing. I'm like, what is this Marxist crap that you're writing about? Right? I mean, the national debt doesn't need to be paid back. Do you know what debt means, dude? Hello. And he kept writing these articles and these posts on this forum I was reading them in. And he had a goddamn answer for everything. And he was very patient and very clear. And at some point, I reached out to him and I was like, all right, what about this, and this? And then he had an answer for everything. And I'm like, oh my God, this is actually starting to make sense. And what I realized is that the most of the people who get this are kind of aiming towards some sort of socialist utopia, which is, hey, there's no constraint on spending. Increasing the money doesn't necessarily mean inflation, and not at all hyperinflation, particularly if we have unused capacity. Therefore, Social Security and Medicare for everyone. We can afford it. Woo! Which is what they're doing.
I would agree that those can be afforded if we reduce maybe the military budget or something. What I'm starting to get a picture of, what it sounds like, is that what you're advocating and would move towards is basically the left-wing answer to the same dilemma that's addressed by maybe the more right-wing economics, like a minarchist like myself, in saying simply, if the deficit itself existing is not necessarily a grave problem, debt itself is not necessarily a grave problem, but how you manage it definitely could be. I think
on that.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that it's not a problem. Here's the long-term reason why it exists. What I would be saying is more of a right-leaning minarchist, economically right-leaning. I would say simply, if you hold that deficit down, it certainly doesn't matter if you're pumping money into the economy in order to keep things going. What matters, though, is the proportion of foreign to domestically held debt, because that could cause a problem, at least diplomatically. Number two, the proportion as opposed to the population. How much does each person potentially have as a share of debt that's being held thus?
But it's not actually debt, is what we're saying. We're not just saying it's not a problem.
Debt.
We're saying it's a requirement in order to have money.
Well,
but some of it's not being used for that purpose. Like the idea of financing some proxy war using money that you're simply commanding to be printed out of thin air is a little bit different.
Well, if we look at the simplistic example of the subsistence economy turning into a fiat money economy, in the initial step, you'll notice there wasn't even any debt yet. You know, the government just injects. I just inject the Nima bucks. Now I leave some people with some Nima bucks, and the debt only comes into play when I go, okay, some of you, do you want to have an interest-bearing alternative to the Nima bucks you're holding in your hands or your pockets or your bank accounts?
Well, that's a problem of interest. What I would say is originally it's just a medium of exchange. The original concept of money is nothing more than something small and portable that can be made in a somewhat controlled system that's used to trade for goods. It's like, let's say that I farm. And in winter, of course, I can't grow my corn or my cabbages or whatever, but I can use that money to purchase from people who have storage in some capacity. It stabilizes a group of people within an organized system so that people aren't starving because they made some minor mistake, because they did what was right. They did their gold mining, and now the mountain pass is frozen solid. They can't go mining, but they've still got this money so they can purchase their pickles or whatever to stay alive through the winter. That's the concept. The fiat currency then was maybe seashells or little white rocks or something. It still had no necessary intrinsic value. It was simply used to stabilize an economy. My problem is, though, if some chieftain comes along and says, okay, now little white rocks for everyone, we're going to print limitless amounts of these white rocks, because we have to keep the economy afloat. It's not necessary to do that. All you need to make sure is that there are enough in circulation to be actually used in a numismatic way.
Well, and to not cause crashes like the ones we observed when the government tries to balance the budget.
Who says that the government should be responsible for preventing crashes at all?
Well, if they cause them, then
if the government, if they cause it by interventionism, what I'm arguing for is a much freer market in which the government is absolved of that responsibility. The private marketplace handles it. If there's a crash, there's a crash. There are going to be downturns.
Yes.
They're unfortunate. And during those periods, we can directly subsidize those who have been screwed over to the best of our abilities to keep them alive and to try to repair things. There's no way for a government ever to achieve, though, a long-term utopia that will never have a crash. That's what I would argue. Whether it's left or right-wing economics, it wouldn't make a difference.
My point was just that what we call the government's debt is really just the government voluntarily introducing an interest-bearing alternative to people who already have money. It's basically like a subsidy for people with money. That's what a sovereign government bond is. And what we're arguing is the government doesn't need to offer any interest. Whatever interest they offer on those bonds is the decision of the government. And the interest payments are certainly an issue. Like you said, if foreigners hold the bonds, or even if just a certain powerful group inside the country holds a lot of government bonds, they basically have a basic income for the rich, in a sense, you could say.
Yeah.
So we're saying that's not needed. We don't need anything like that. We could just introduce the money into circulation and offer maybe very low interest bonds if we want to. I'm not really for it, but I'm just trying to explain how the government's debt isn't really a debt in the sense that we know it privately. When I go in debt, when I borrow from the bank or from some money lender, then I have to earn that money to be able to repay it. But the government is not in that position if it's a sovereign government. Now
I definitely agree with that, but you identify that as not a problem. I identify that as a big problem. I think that the government should spend wisely. If it wants to have a year-over-year deficit, that's fine. If it's keeping pace with the growth of the economy at large, not a problem. If people think that debt is out of control too. They think any debt's out of control. I've got student loan debt, for example, that I'm paying off. It's not a big problem. I make my payments. I make more than the payments. the time that I spent in college, while I didn't get a degree and was miserable when I was at UVM for the most part, it did provide a springboard to the knowledge I have now that's allowed me to make most of the rest of my money. All the book work that I've done and all the income that comes in is in part because I went to college, because I was in anthropology. I sort of got a general sense of what I should be looking into, what I was interested in, what I was good at. And that's just fine. But if I were year over year, if I were to go back there and say, okay, well, I'm going to keep taking out this debt over and over, you must have really, really great central planners if you're going to do that, because some of that money that's being printed out is not being used just to put back into circulation.
Yeah, no, I think we're in agreement on the size and scope of government, and we're not necessarily saying that the government should spend more and more, because we're so overtaxed. It would be very easy to address the problem in a manner that's consistent with how the fiat money system functions, by just cutting taxes drastically.
I would agree with you, though. The debt is not as big as a problem as some believe.
Not in a sovereign government, exactly. Yeah. It is where you have countries that owe foreign currency. You know, like if Venezuela owes foreigners US dollars, or like in Europe, essentially. Europe, every individual country owes a foreign currency. That's why the deficit countries like Greece keep running into issues.
Didn't Europe have to give Venezuela like 10 billion big ones recently just to keep them in existence?
I didn't hear about that.
I didn't hear about
that. I think that was several months ago. I think Europe either forgave a bunch of debt or gave them free money, and I think China did too.
Okay.
Just to keep, it's like, why prolong the misery? Let their economy collapse at this point so Maduro gets a bullet between his eyes.
The bringing up Venezuela is a interesting segue, and I think it can allow us to elucidate a very important point, which is because obviously Venezuela is going into hyperinflation right now, and Maduro is doing things like, I'll just delete some zeros, everything's cool.
I saw that. It was very funny.
I'll raise the minimum wage and delete zeros.
I wish that I had like a fan in Venezuela who could ship me like an entire pallet of their money.
Say that.
I'd be willing to like ship them $100 and it'd be worth 10 times as much. But
build a greenhouse out of it.
I have a whole pallet of currency. This is great.
Swim in it like Scrooge McDuck.
Exactly. That's what I want to do. Yeah. American dream achieved.
Looks like Nima just ran out to get something, but I want to say this in the meantime, which is that, so both of us just made the argument that spending money doesn't necessarily lead to inflation, and specifically doesn't lead to hyperinflation. Oh, does he have a Venezuelan, whatever they have? How big is the denomination on that?
I can only see the little picture there, because you're not speaking.
Oh, okay, speaking. This is
10 billion.
Zimbabwe, 10 billion. I'm rich. I'm billionaire, basically, you know.
I think I have a 10 billion note from Yugoslavia from when they went through hyperinflation somewhere.
Nice.
It's worth as much as a loaf of bread.
That's a lot, actually.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say about hyperinflation and Venezuela, or specifically socialist countries, you brought up Yugoslavia as well, is that when money is spent into existence, the private sector has to have the freedom to be able to do something with it. And if it's overregulated or super overtaxed, or you need a license to fart, you can't, which is kind of the case that we have now in the United States. You can't really do anything with it. And particularly in a socialist country, you're not allowed to do anything. Like in Venezuela, if you hoard toilet paper, you'll get a SWAT team sent to your door. Right? So no one's allowed to create anything using the money that's demanded in taxes. So the hyperinflation doesn't actually come from the money creation. The hyperinflation comes from the production destruction. And if you look at historical examples, the big ones everyone likes to bring up are Weimar, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. The same thing happened in all three instances, where there was a massive destruction of the production, coupled with the fact that the country kept printing money to try to deal with it. And there's a third one in all three of these, is that the currency was always pegged to something other than that the government could create on its own. For the Weimar, it was gold, and I believe for Zimbabwe and Venezuela, it was the U.S. dollar. And in terms of a sovereign nation, it doesn't matter what the material is, as long as they can't create it. It puts the same limit on them, because they have to treat that money like you and I do, where you have to earn it somehow. You can't just create it out of nowhere. So
Zimbabwe had the land reform, right? Weimar had Germany. You had French troops marching into Western Germany and literally made Germans extract gold at gunpoint, etc. So you had productive capacity fleeing the country.
You also had the Treaty of Versailles preventing them from rigging heavy industry.
Treaty of Versailles put a massive foreign debt on them that had to be paid in gold marks. So there you go. That's a debt that the country cannot produce itself, and it's basically an unreasonable amount of debt that puts the country into depression. And so that's what happened in these instances. You just had productive capacity collapsing massively. And when productive capacity collapses, prices go up. And when prices go up, then the government needs to print more money to be able to afford the same amount of goods they were able to afford before. So there's actually been some research that says that the hyperinflation wasn't caused by the money printing, but the money printing was caused by the hyperinflation, which was in turn caused by productive factors rather than monetary factors.
Yeah, well, that could make sense.
And in fact,
I would say, though, if you're going to institute leftist programs, whether they're economic or not, though, it has to be preceded by right-wing libertarianism in every other sense.
Yeah,
you have to have an extremely constitutionally constrained government, an extremely probably a well-armed population, one that's guaranteed in its rights by force, if necessary.
We agree. In fact, I don't know if we were clear about this. I at least consider myself an anarchist. I've never actually had Nima raise his right hand and swear to that. But we are not leftists in the slightest little bit. Yeah. And particularly for me, learning this stuff was actually quite hard, because I'm like, oh my God, are you saying that all the shit that I thought was the supreme evil might only be like moderate evil? I don't know if I can handle that. But in terms of the ability to afford stuff, and if we come back to the United States and you bring up these proxy wars, which is, I think the way to understand the economics of the proxy war isn't so much the money as it is the resources.
Oh, I definitely understand that. I'm under I'm under no illusions about that.
Like all that steel that could have been used for a building or a car is turned into a tank. And
we want to build these oil pipelines. No, says Saddam. Okay. Oh, Saddam's got WMDs.
Right.
Oh, look how cheap heroin is now, you know.
Yay, now we're all tweakers.
Yeah. The pharma companies loved it. It's almost like the Monsanto war, the invasion of Afghanistan. GlaxoSmith, Bayer.
So one of the reasons that Nima and I have really been pushing this MMT concept, because if it's accurate, and we believe it is, right now, the only people talking about it are leftists.
Yeah.
And it's the Bernie Sanders crowd, which unfortunately is incredibly popular in the country right now. And if they're to get a hold of it, if they were to get power, if the Republicans fuck up as much as you've been saying for the last week,
they're having problems, yeah.
And the Democrats get power, they get the reform, the interior reform that, again, you're always talking about, where the progressives managed to throw off some of these neoliberal shackles. And they say, okay, we can afford, look, here's the math, here's the economics, we can afford the healthcare, we can afford the education, and we can afford the Social Security. The issue that I really see is, yes, we can afford it, and maybe even for a couple of decades, it would work. But eventually, because of the nature of bureaucracy, as you're pointing out, that we need a lot of libertarian minarchist stuff to back this up, and a well-armed population. The nature of bureaucracy is it's gonna provide less and less and demand more and more.
Yeah,
and particularly as the bureaucracy starts training the next generation of bureaucrats. You know, it's one thing if you take people out of the free market and you stick them in the bureaucracy, where they're like, okay, I still have free market thinking and I want to do that as best as I can within this system.
Yeah.
That's an entirely different world from someone who's like, oh my God, if I get this job, I never have to do anything, and I get this awesome pension and I can't get fired.
That's really the problem. That's really the problem for every program. Because it's like people on the left have instituted some good on paper ideas like, hey, we're going to protect workers. Okay. But then, 100 years later, you have 1 million government workers overseeing the workers' protections. They're taking bribes. They let one corporation go and fuck another over for political reasons, and it just gets completely out of hand and reduces efficiency in the system.
Or they'll put a business out of business for some minor infraction, and it's like, well, I guess no one has a job now. Thanks.
Your wheelchair ramp is 0.5 centimeter too low. Shame on you, you evil.
Actually, I have a very specific example of that. So I'm flipping a property right now.
Yeah.
And we put in a manufactured home, and I had to have the state electrical inspector go out there and check it. And the electrician called me up, and he's like, "You don't have stairs going into your back deck." And I'm like, "It's like 3 feet high. Can you just take a big step?" And he's like, "If you don't have some sort of stairs, he will not go up there because it's a safety concern." And I'm like, "Fucking." And the place is like an hour and a half away from me. Like, can you just put a ladder or something so I don't have to drive out there? He was able to do it.
So in your state, you can't even sell a property, like to a consenting voluntary buyer, or are you like?
No. So we had the electrical installed. And in order for it to get permitted by the county, it needs You have
to get a permit to have electricity
to install it.
Oh, that's weird.
Well, to have the electrician come in, and I mean, it makes sense a little. We were pulling it from the street.
Oh, okay.
Right. And so LNI, which is our labor and industries in Washington State, which is the fucking workforce mafia.
In other words, the devil.
Yes. So that they come out and say, okay, this was done correctly. And if I didn't have, because it was like this 3-foot step up to get into the house, that's too dangerous and they wouldn't do it. And I would have had to call them back later.
I've got a great idea. If you had the funds, build a Rube Goldberg machine where the dude gets on a lift 30 feet away and through a complicated series of gears and balloons and stuff, then he slowly makes his way over.
If you make the GoFundMe for it, I'll do it.
Yeah, that would be so epic. This is bureaucracy in action, you could call it. But that's like the state of Vermont. It's like I have to pay sky-high in-state taxes. It's like on the federal level, I might pay less taxes this year than last, despite making more. But on the state level, I have to pay like $2-3 grand more probably. And it's like they barely got done retarring the roads through the city of Rutland. Even now, they're not like perfect. It's like everything else is totally fucked up.
Yep,
that's socialism. This is Bernie Sanders' state. Just in case anyone's wondering, Bernie Sanders is the senator from this state.
So, but before we all get on the train of just bashing bureaucracy, because I'm sure all of us could do it all day, the reason why I wanted to bring that up is that Nima and I, having come to the conclusion that this economic theory is accurate, have said if we don't have some people in the in quotes right start talking about this, what's going to happen is they're eventually going to fuck everything up, which they're on their way to doing right now. The progressives are going to get in. They're going to say, look, the MMT works. It's going to be put into position. They're going to start making decisions based off of it. It's going to work, at least for a few years, maybe a couple decades. And by the time anyone realizes the issue, it's going to be way, 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 way too late. So what Nima and I want to do is have this conversation for the, again, in quotes, right, so we can start discussing, okay, if this is accurate, what is a way that we can treat it that's consistent with the idea that the government should be small and get out of everybody's way?
Well, my own personal feeling would be first you'd need constitutionalism. Constitutionalism has to come in first to make sure the constraints are in place. Then you have to have the right wing come in second to pound the bureaucracy, and then and only then can you institute the sort of situation that you're talking about. The problem is most people in society, not some, but most, unfortunately, are very short-sighted. The constitutionalists would never do something that would be seen as working with the left or even with garden variety conservatives. The conservatives would never work with actual libertarianism or with the left, and the left would never work with either of them either. And so on that token, I don't know, maybe you need a Pinochet or something to come in as a temporary dictator and restructure things.
So here's an idea. I'm not necessarily standing behind this. I'm just throwing it out on the brainstorm whiteboard.
Helicopters?
Right. That's in the corner, yes. Did you see that one meme? It was it went something like at first they came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't say anything. And after that, nobody came for anybody, and everything was pretty great.
Yeah. I haven't seen that one, but I got it though.
But
Jesus.
So, in line with what you said, where we can have this great conversation and figure out the way the economy works and design a utopia, and say, okay, if we follow these blueprints, everything's going to work fine. Great, no one's going to listen to us.
Or not a utopia, but
something better.
The job shouldn't be to find a utopia, just the best possible, most stable working system, acknowledging that there will be problems. But you've got to have constraints in place to prevent people from overthrowing what would otherwise be a really great system just at the drop of the hat because there's a slight economic downturn. Knowing that there could be worse if the systems
than my term utopia. Keeping in mind that we could think of that right now, and pretty much no one, in quotes, not enough people are going to listen to it to make it work. If we were to say something where we could say, okay, conservatives, you can cut the self-employment tax permanently.
I'd love that.
Get rid of it. And remember, self-employment tax includes FICA. It punishes everybody. It punishes the employer for hiring you, and it punishes the employee for working for you, and it punishes you for starting your own business. It punishes everybody.
You're preaching to the choir. I'm an author.
I got my own business too.
Yeah.
So does Nima. If the conservative side of things could come out and say, okay, we're gonna not touch Social Security and Medicare as it stands. We're not saying we agree with it. We're not saying it's a great idea, but as it stands, we're not going to touch it. But we're going to completely eliminate the self-employment tax.
Yeah, eliminating taxes
that would be pretty
is the
popular.
easy part. Eliminating any tax is the easy part.
We agree.
It's just the cutting the spending that's difficult. I think you'd need probably a grand bargain where, well, the first step would be you'd need a stronger libertarian party, a trifecta sort of system. And if the libertarians, socialist side of the Democrats, and the more true, like, populistic conservatives could get together, they'd have the power necessary to put in the reforms step by step that we're all talking about. The problem is you'd have the entire establishment that already has all of the money opposing them, and they're very, very effective at smearing. They're very, very effective at defaming. They control basically the whole corporate media, which offshores all of its taxes and work. They control Silicon Valley, making people aware that, this monetary concept that you two are talking about even exists would be difficult. They would headhunt after you both.
Are you talking about the New World Order by chance?
No, I'm talking about the military-industrial complex, specifically as it involves human communication now, especially.
I completely agree, and it's something that the leftist MMTers are also complaining about because the neoliberals are smashing them over the head trying to shut them up.
Well, it's like I saw the other day, Reddit started quarantining subreddits. I don't use it. I'm a 4chan user, but apparently they were attacking communist subreddits, and then the headline news was that they were kicking Nazis off. So you can see they're going after anyone who is not part of the establishment.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed. Well, it'll be hard.
Warned people of that.
For sure. It's for sure it'll be hard, but got to start somewhere. So going back to what you were saying, because I think this point still needs to be cleared up, is you kept referring to constraints on the government, and in specifically talking about debts and deficits and money creation and stuff. Can you tell me what exactly you meant by those constraints?
Yeah, the government right now takes far too much liberty. Again, a capped tax rate, an upper rate that can be taxed for any individual. Like if someone's got a business, they shouldn't have. They're paying taxes on that. They're paying their personal income tax maybe on the side. They're paying all sorts of other taxes and fees. Nobody should be taxed out of existence. We've got a situation where on paper it looks fairly low. The overall rates, but in pragmatic situations, it's quite high for some people. Like, I can't remember what tax rate I paid. I think it was higher than Joe Biden's, and he makes 7 figures. It's crazy. Corporations pay almost nothing because they use some double Irish scheme or whatever. Meanwhile, the little person who's making 60, 70K a year gets totally screwed, pooed, and tattooed.
Completely agree. So I think we're in agreement on those constraints. Yeah. And in fact...
Well, I'd go further. I mean, private businesses that take tax subsidies, like Silicon Valley, wouldn't be able to censor people. I would eliminate all existing gun control. I do not care if someone owns a rocket launcher. I really don't, because if they utilize it, they die. Well, problem solved. We got rid of enough violent genetics in the country, I guess.
Again, agreement there. Good. Yeah, totally agreed. Yeah, I'm. Despite being an anarchist, I don't think that these Silicon Valley are just private companies that should be able to do whatever they want.
Yeah,
it's a bunch of horse shit. But specifically, I wanted to get back to the conversation of what exactly debt is for a sovereign issuer of currency versus what debt is for a user of currency. And the example that I like to give, this is kind of dorky like Nima's Nima Bucks, is imagine I have a magical pouch that I can pull an infinite amount of money out at will.
I saw that coming, yeah.
That's the story of the Manitou. It's actually a folk story, 1800s.
Well, shit. I didn't even know about it.
Yep, there was a dude that prayed to the devil for infinite money and whiskey and the ability to fuck any woman he wanted, and he gets it. And then, of course, after a while of short enjoyment, he's dying, and he's like, "Oh no, please, Jesus, save me!" And then, the devil comes and takes him to hell.
What's the name of that story?
Look up the Manitou, Manitou. It's sort of a Native American legend about this sort of pagan creature. The Christians considered it, though, to be Satan.
Nice.
Okay, so I made a deal with Satan, and I got this pouch.
Yeah. You've got some hot money there.
I got some hot money here. So I can infinitely take money out of this pouch, and I can infinitely put it back in, and it just disappears.
Yeah.
So let's say I take some money out, and I give it to you, and I give it to Nima, and a third person comes to me and says, "Hey, can I have some money?" Does you or Nima giving me that money back have anything to do with my ability to pay that person?
Not really, but can I pose a counter situation?
Sure.
Let's say that you've got 2 sovereign entities that can print their own money. Mm-hmm. And one of them has a big military backed by nuclear weapons, tanks, aircraft carriers, the whole 9 yards, like the United States. And the other sovereign entity is Belgium or Vietnam, Rwanda or something. Who actually owes the money? The smaller power does, the one that can't actually defend itself. The reason why the larger countries, the US, China, the EU, technically speaking, Russia now, of course, and maybe the minor nuclear players to some extent, the reason why they act at great liberty is specifically because who's going to attack them? Who's going to attack the United States and commit suicide and have every single civilian that they have fucking butchered? Nobody can recall the debt. China can't have its debt recalled because nobody dares.
So this is what we're saying, is that to recall the debt doesn't make sense.
But for all other nations, for most of the nations in the world, recalling the debt is easy. You simply use some gunboat diplomacy.
But
hey, we've got an aircraft. Hey, South Korea, we've got aircraft carriers. You don't. Hey, Portugal. Hey, about that $1 million you owe us.
So. Entertain this thought that China supposedly has all this U.S. debt, right? We've already talked about it's not the greatest holder of it, but it's pretty big. The way that they got that debt, in quotes, is that China exports a lot of stuff to the United States, and obviously the United States pays in dollars. Usually, private entities. Those dollars make it over to China, and once it's in China, because the unit of account isn't dollars, it's yen. The Chinese go, what am I supposed to do with these dollars? And they exchange them for yuan at the Chinese government or the Chinese central bank. The Chinese central bank, now sitting on all these dollars, says, well, now that we have all this money, we might as well get an interest-bearing alternative. So let's buy up a bunch of bonds, U.S. bonds. And so it's not actually debt in the sense that anybody needs it back or something has to, the United States needs to earn it in order to pay it back. It's simply a different security, analogous to a savings account and a checking account. A checking account, typically, I don't get any interest on, but I can spend it very easily. A savings account, the bank will pay me a certain amount of interest, but I got to move it back over to my checking account before I can write a check. In the same way, reserves or cash, more or less, don't pay any interest. I think right now they pay like 0.25% or something, whereas the bonds do. So they're both government securities issued by the federal government at will, without any restraint, because they're sovereign. They could write as many or as little as they want.
Yeah.
The difference that what we're suggesting is that debt is just money in a savings account.
Yeah. The one problem that I would interject possibly is the possibility that a foreign state, if it held enough of your debt, could cash it all out at once and cause problems.
But what does cash out the debt mean?
Well, if they've got a bunch of bonds, they could call in the debt that they hold.
But they would sell them,
grab up all the money,
buy them all up. So technically, there's no issue really there.
So the Federal
Reserve, the government seems slightly concerned about China holding so much of our debt because it may be an aggressor nation.
Yeah, but
I'm sure China's
people who don't understand MMT or people who do, who are just psyching it up in order for whatever political advantage they're trying to get at the time.
I don't know. A lot of them seem to be on the left at various times, and they love China. They take money from the Chinese government all the time through slush funds.
Right, but...
Well, also, I got to say this. I do have to go within the next minute or two.
Oh, well.
Yeah.
We might have to leave it at that then.
Yeah.
I don't know how to continue with only taking it a minute. So, how about this? We'll wrap it up for now. Super appreciate you having you on.
Yeah, I'd love to be back.
I love watching your stuff. Let's publish this. Okay. We could all link it around, see what reaction everybody gets, and have a follow-up conversation about it.
Yeah, just to make sure on Twitter to send me the link once it's up, and I'd love to come back aboard. Absolutely. Maybe we can talk about a bit more politics as well. Absolutely. I mean, you two know more about economics than I do, so.
And I got to say, before you go, I love your attention to nuance when it comes to politics.
Well, thank you.
Where it's like, okay, I think this person's got this kind of attitude, and he's got this sort of type of personality, and he's thinking about this. So when he says that, he actually means this, and that's going to affect this guy. I love that shit. You're great at it.
By the way, I noticed you have an AT2020 microphone.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
It's Editor's Keys 150. Is that the same thing?
It looks exactly the same.
Okay. This is the first microphone I ever owned. I'm not a sound guy. I don't like.
It sounds really good.
Voice, and I bought it.
Blue Yeti is though the best. I've been using an AT2020 for several years, but the Blue Yeti actually on its stand is actually better.
Excellent. I'll probably get a Blue Yeti next then. I've heard that from other sources that Blue Yeti's the way to go.
It's pretty good.
Cool. Well, with that being said, I'm Dylan Lawrence Moore of the Volitional Science Network. That's Nima over there of economicsjunkie.com. Hi, Nima. And Styx can't wave back to us because he's on audio only from the YouTube channel Styxhexenhammer666. I'm sure you know him better than you know us. And we're looking forward to another conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good one.